I need to. Hi everyone, welcome to Harold Liu's talk on hacking the job interview, how to dos and some clues for all things interviews. Oh no, actually, I should have let Harold say that. But yeah, welcome to the stream, everyone. I'll just let Harold take it away now.
Oh, thanks, Madhav. Can I just say I'm actually really happy about the rhyme that I put into that. It took me a little bit of time to actually come up with that, but I think it's worked out quite nicely. Yeah, so as he said, my name's Harold. And today I'm going to go through, I guess, a few sort of bits and pieces around job interviews and that kind of stuff. So a bit of context on who I am and I guess why I'm even remotely qualified to have an opinion on the stuff. I work at a company called BlackRock. We are a multidisciplinary recruitment company here in Brisbane. So I myself specialize in helping companies hire software developers. And so that, and then we work with companies that range from startups all the way through to financial institutions, large enterprises, all that kind of stuff. So I've been doing it for about 4 and a bit years now. And I have literally lost count of the number of interviews that I've conducted with people myself and prepared people to kind of go on to. So yeah, the whole topic of job interviews, there's a lot of, I guess, sort of general conversations, questions around what works, what doesn't work, what should you do, that kind of stuff. And so yeah, I wanted to kind of give my take on it, share a few stories and takes and that kind of stuff. So to just jump right in, I wanted to start by going over a few kind of bits and pieces that got brought up in the UQCS Slack channel specifically, and I thought it made sense to kind of address these first and to start from there. So the first one that I got asked from was the differences when it comes to interviewing at a bigger technology company versus at a smaller to medium size business. And to be honest, as far as like the actual interview process goes and that kind of stuff, they tend to be actually reasonably similar to a degree. Like ultimately, the actual case by case experience will just differ, depending on people and that kind of stuff. But in terms of like larger differences, like there really aren't really any. If anything, I would actually say that there are more things to kind of consider from the applicant or the candidate perspective side of things, just when it comes to what they should be mindful of and things that they might want to kind of ask and talk about when it comes to interviewing at a larger company versus interviewing at like a small to medium sized one. And they're really those considerations are really just a product of differences in scale. With larger companies, obviously, there's going to be a lot more kind of verticality in terms of team structures, hierarchy, and that sort of stuff, which in some cases can be great because it generally means that as a business, they tend to be a lot more mature. And so when it comes to progression, onboarding, training, mobility, all that kind of stuff, it's just they tend to have a lot more structure in place. As opposed to smaller companies where those kind of things may have just been, I guess, implemented in a little bit more of an ad hoc kind of way, and just not as like formalized and structured. So the things to kind of think about there in terms of the business, it really just kind of depends on what you sort of want to go for. I guess the reason why some people that we speak to tend to kind of want to either move away from big tech or avoid it altogether is that as a result of that verticality, you tend to be, I guess, sort of abstracted away from the nitty gritty of the business. And what I mean by that is that because of how deep the structure can be, sometimes you can be doing work where you're fairly removed from the actual I guess, commercial reasons for why it's happening, or, the customer outcome it's going to be generating, to the point where you end up just sort of, I guess, handling tickets in a team, in a division, in a group, in an office somewhere. Which is totally fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just something that some people just kind of don't particularly enjoy. Um, Whereas on the contrary, with a smaller company, just through sheer numbers and scale, really, more often than not, you tend to be more closely tied to what's happening in the business. To a larger degree, what's happening, what impact you're having to customers and end users and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of the actual interview process, it really depends, but there's not really any kind of like hard and fast differences between the two. It's more just like on an individual basis. Um, the next one that I kind of got brought up was how does the interview process differ when it comes to interviewing as an intern, or for an intern or a grad position, versus for someone more experienced. And that's one that does actually tend to see a few differences, both in terms of like how you even get to the interview phase, and also just kind of what things kind of tend to be assessed during the interview. The first one I kind of wanted to touch on was how important it is to show interest, both in the business and in, I guess, the wider industry or the wider profession that you're interviewing for as a whole. When you have a bit more commercial experience under your belt, you obviously have a lot more commercially relevant skills, and just general kind of things to speak about and to be assessed on. Whereas when you're more towards the beginning of your career, there's really not a whole lot for companies to kind of really assess you on. And I guess this kind of speaks to the second point in terms of measurables and what you can actually be measured on. As an intern or as a grad, so much of what companies look for, or try to look for, I should say, is really just how much potential you have. How likely are you to grow and take on knowledge and be motivated to take on knowledge and grow, if they hire you? Like, at the end of the day, as a junior, you really represent an investment for the company, much more so than if they're hiring someone with more commercial experience. And whether you agree with it or whether you or not, interest is going to be interest in the domain, interest in software engineering in general, or or graphic design, or whatever the discipline is that you're kind of wanting to start working in. Demonstrable interest is going to be taken as an indicator of potential, because I guess from a conceptual level, the more interested you are in something, the more likely you are to kind of seek out learning and knowledge in that area, and just through I guess sheer exposure and volume, the more likely you are to kind of get better at it. That's from my experience, the logic train there. And so, yeah, important, like being able to show interest is and being able to demonstrate interest, whether it's through extracurriculars and that kind of stuff, is much more important when you're an intern or a grad versus when you have more commercial experience. The other thing to consider is that in terms of the questions you're going to be asked when you're an intern or a grad, I find that people tend to kind of get ask you a lot more questions that are intended to act as, I guess, discussion questions, and kind of get your opinion on things, and get a sense of how much you know, just from like a self-learning perspective, from a conceptual level. Not so much asking you, and this will depend on the companies and that sort of stuff. But for the most part, not so much asking you about things that you kind of learned about, or lectures or whatever, but more just kind of wanting to get your opinion on things, and get an idea of how you think and how you communicate, as just due to the fact that you won't have a whole lot of relevant things to kind of recount and discuss from an experience standpoint, in contrast to when you have more commercial experience, where companies will want to get a better understanding of past work that you've done and talk through it, and then kind of tack on a discussion portion to that. So yeah, there are definitely a few differences between interviewing as an intern or a grad versus interviewing as a more experienced person. Software companies versus, I guess, companies that aren't necessarily software or technology focused that just happen to have developers. Again, it tends to depend. Similar to enterprises versus smaller businesses, there really aren't really kind of like hard and fast set differences in this stuff. Um, as as a candidate, there are I guess one or two considerations. One being that if you're working in a software company, you tend to be just much more, I guess, sort of engineering focused. Whereas if I contrast that with a a company that just happens to work within the technology domain, specifically within consulting, you'll have more opportunities, or more likely to get opportunities, I should say, to do work and be exposed to, I guess, the more commercial side of technology, whether it's kind of working with clients, engaging with customers, just, I guess, dealing with stakeholders in general, dealing with the pre and post aspects of delivering software into the world, whether it's I guess following up on things, doing pre-sales, all that kind of stuff. You tend to have some more opportunities to do that kind of work in a non-software company versus within like a specifically software company. And so ultimately it'll come down to what you want to be interested in and that kind of stuff. The other thing I find is that with software companies, there tends to be a little bit more of an emphasis with the screening steps and interview questions and that kind of stuff to want to do a deep dive into technology and really go hard into like your knowledge when it comes to tech and computer science principles. Um, More so than in a non-technology, or in a non-software company, I should say, where there's a little bit more of an interest in getting an idea of how well you can map um, those kind of technology concepts and computer science concepts to actual commercial outcomes and business outcomes. So not really any major differences, but there are one or two things to, I guess, sort of consider in that regard. So moving on. Starting the interview process, you really want to kind of be thinking about, or there are really things that you can be starting to look at and think about a year out from your first interview, which I guess is a non-cliche way to say is that the interview process really starts before the interview. And so from the context of, I guess, as a university student, right now, whether you're in your final year, penultimate year, first year, whatever, you can really get started now with just beginning with what do you actually want to be doing. So many people I speak to kind of go into just the general job application process without a clear idea of what it is they actually want to do beyond just like, oh, like I want to get a job as a software engineer, which is great, but doing well in your interview all begins with making sure you're actually invested and interested in the places that you're interviewing at. And obviously, that all starts with having a clear idea on what it is you're actually interested in. And leading on from that, once you actually have a clear idea on what it is that you're interested in, to actually succeed in landing the interview, there are a few pieces there. Between I guess sort of things that you can be doing now that isn't just, I guess, working on your resume or whatever, and that'll include, I guess, extracurricular activities, getting involved in events, like volunteering at conferences, working on open source projects. I could do an entirely separate talk, and I have done so on just this. But really, kind of working on making yourself appealing and kind of making sure that someone is actually going to be interested in interviewing you. And that'll extend to networking as well. And so from 1 year out to 1 month out, and 1 month out, you could really substitute the 1 month part for however far ahead you want to start looking at, I guess, reaching out to companies, applying to companies, trying to land interviews with companies. I know that with larger companies with grad programs and internships and that kind of stuff, they obviously have set application times and dates and that kind of thing. And so substitute 1 month with whatever the timeline of the deadline is that you kind of need to sort of address and account for to kind of get in the door. And so 1 month out, or however long out from the interview, you really need to sort of start researching places that actually are going to, I guess, sort of be able to pay you to do the things that you've kind of figured out that you enjoy doing. And what I mean by that is you really need to start narrowing down on names and companies and places that you've come across in the time leading up to this. Along with that, now like around this time is that the time you really kind of need to kind of polish up your CV and get your resume ready. Your resume is ultimately a tool for landing the interview itself. A lot of people kind of make the mistake of leaving your resume in a state where it's like, oh, it's fine. I'm gonna I can elaborate on that kind of stuff once I'm actually in the interview, without realizing that your resume is a tool that gets you in the interview itself. And besides that, it's really just an exercise in kind of reaching out to people, and contacting people and companies that you want to get interviewed by and be interviewed for a job with or a placement with or whatever. So it's pretty straightforward. And again, this is a topic that I can kind of do a whole nother talk on, but yeah, actually just start reaching out to people. So closer to the interview, closer to the actual interview. So 1 week out, you've applied to a few places, you've heard back, people have actually come back to you saying that they want to interview you. Now's the time you can start being a bit more specific. And I guess sort of start doing preparations with specific interviews and specific jobs in mind. And what I mean by that is now's the time to really kind of have a think about the hard and fast details on why it is you actually applied for the places that you applied for, and why it is you're excited about working with them. And this is the time to really start thinking about, okay, in terms of the potential role that you might be applying for there, like what is it about doing that kind of work at this company that is that's going to be interesting for you? Is it a company that is working in a domain that's maybe has personal importance to you, or is of particular interest to you for X reason? Is it because the company does work or is solving a problem which is particularly interesting to you? Is it because people that you especially admire, worked there or founded there, and they are founded on ideals that you really believe in? It could be anything. But now's the time to kind of really flesh it out, because for the most part, at some point in the interview process, it's incredibly likely that someone's going to ask you, like, hey, why do you actually want to work here? And in some cases, places will actually ask you that before or during the application process. So be specific. Who will you be meeting? For me, when I'm preparing candidates for interviews, I make a point to always try and clarify who it is they're actually going to be interviewed by. And off the back of that, send them, links to LinkedIn profiles, blog articles, whatever it is, by the people they're going to be meeting, just so that you can get a bit more context. At the very least, so that you can just put, faces to names or that kind of thing. It's just always kind of nice and helpful. But you never know. Like, you never know when there's going to be a connection there that you can kind of reference, and that just might help kind of spark conversation. And it's always helpful to have a bit of background information on the people you're going to be meeting. And the other thing is that it might also help kind of give you an idea of what you might want to ask them in the way of questions and that kind of stuff. Off the back of, I guess, being specific about what the company does, why does it interest you, why do you want to do the job, having insight into that will also help you kind of try and, I guess, even just spitball or hypothesize on what it is you're actually going to be asked on. If you are I guess, interviewing for like a cloud engineering role, chances are they're going to want to ask you, things about, hey, like how do you, what's your take on elastic scalability? How do you deal with high availability systems? What do you know about that kind of stuff? Are you familiar with Docker, containerization? Do you know what kubeflow is? All that kind of stuff. It's always tough to, like, you'll never really have an exact idea of what it is you're going to be asked. Like that's kind of like having the answers to the exam before walking in, but you can always kind of at least have some kind of idea on the general type of things they might be interested in and prepare yourself for that. And then on the flip side with questions, you want to start having to think about what it is that you want to learn from the interview as well. The interview and application process is always a two-way street, whether you're a grad or whether you're a CTO. It's as much a chance for you to learn more about the company and the people and the problems they're solving, to get insight into, like, hey, like, do you actually even want to work there? Like, do you want to work with these people? Do you want to be doing what they're doing? The interview itself is really your first opportunity to actually, well, in most cases, your first opportunity to speak to someone that's actually, doing what it is you're hoping to do, or has done what it is you're hoping to do. And so in some ways, it's a glimpse into the future for you. And so why not? Like, why not take the opportunity to kind of, ask questions and find out more? I saw it asked in the Slack recently about, hey, are there any particular questions that are good to ask? Honestly, nothing really. I guess it's always nice to. Well, I mean, it's always helpful to ask people, hey, hey, like, what do you struggle with? What are things that were problematic for you? Why do you like working at the business? Those are, I know those tend to be quite stereotypical and quite, like, obvious questions to ask, but the fact of the matter is, like, they are important, and there's always a chance that they are going to give you insight into what it's like working at the company and what it's like for them. So questions and things that you want to learn from the interview, 1 week out, start thinking about them, start writing them down, start hashing them out, and start figuring out and narrowing down which ones you actually want to, like, make an effort to ask and carve out an opportunity for yourself to ask in the interview. Okay, so one day out, the day before the interview. This is kind of like the day before the exam in a way, where hopefully you've done the majority of your preparations, and ideally you would have done most of the things that you could be doing to prepare. But there are, I guess, some last minute finishing or polish points that you could be sort of doing. Logistics, as far as, assuming that these are places that even just locally, it's always helpful to get an idea of, like, okay, how long is the commute going to take? How long should ahead should you prepare? Doubly so if you've traveled interstate or even internationally for, like, an on-site type of interview. Man, if you're in a foreign country or foreign city, cannot stress enough how important it is for you to have logistics figured out the day beforehand, just to make sure you're not late. Questions, now is probably is the point when you wanna kind of make sure that you have the questions that you want to ask clear in your mind, and so that on the day you're not kind of, like, drawn, at a loss or at a blank, or kind of, like, grasping at questions that you want to ask. And then general reminders and reviewing. At this point, you should have done all your research, but now is a good time to kind of really just kind of do a last minute sort of check up on, hey, can you give a Twitter summary on what it is the company does and what it is that interests you about them? Like, do you have a clear idea of what it is you're actually doing? Because again, it's always helpful to have these kind of quick, concise answers and information put together. Just noticed Kian actually just dropped a question in. What are your thoughts on dual ladder career paths, manager and IC being separate parallel paths up to a certain point? Individual contributor. Um, it's kind of an interesting question. Uh, to be honest, like I haven't really seen a lot of that stuff. Like it seems to be the case that potential for growth as an individual contributor really kind of hits a ceiling much sooner than as a manager. Primarily because the manager pathway seems to be the pathway you need to take to move into those, solution architect, CTO type of roles, or even just like higher levels of management, as opposed to ICs kind of being capped at like a developer and sort of being hard to escalate from there. And so at the moment, it feels like IC kind of like just caps out earlier. Do I see this changing in Australia? In the short to medium term, probably not. Primarily because I just don't think the maturity is there in software companies to really be able to kind of derive escalating amounts of value from an IC. The fact of the matter is, like, I guess the scope of the work and the potential payoff for the businesses in really, I mean, primarily Queensland, because that's kind of where we're focused, but I'll hypothesize and say for the rest of Australia as well. It's just really not quite there yet. The depth of the ecosystem is just not quite where you see it in the US and Europe and elsewhere in the world. So longer term, maybe. I'm not like, I can't really peer into the crystal ball, 10, 15 years down in the future. It's just hard to say. But right now, it seems like ICs tend to be capped at a lower point than managers. But good question. Hopefully that was helpful. 1 hour out. Okay, so this is really at that point. If I want to sort of go back to the university exam analogy, this is like literally you're on the walk down to like the UQ Center or whatever. Like at this point, you can be doing some last minute cramming or whatever, but let's be honest, it's probably not really going to be helpful. I really only had one thing that I kind of wanted to address at this point, which was just mindset. I've been given one piece of advice on interviews, which is about a year ago, and it's really stuck with me now. And I tell everyone who will listen about it, and that is that you want to always just remember that the person interviewing you wants you to be successful, and they want you to be the person they end up hiring. I find that a lot of people kind of walk into interviews just nervous, and in some cases, like flat out scared, which is perfectly natural. Like if you are on the way to an interview for something that you're excited about and you're hoping to land, it's only natural for you to be nervous about the possibility of failure. I totally get that. But what I find is that a lot of that nervousness also tends to stem from this perception that interviewing is somehow like an adversarial kind of experience, and that it's kind of a case of like, oh, the interviewers are setting a bar that you need to try and pass, which in a very, very, very loose sense is kind of true. But I think it's much more effective, and to be honest, like much more logical for you to approach interviews with the mentality instead of you and the interviewer or the interviewers are having a conversation about a mutual interest or shared interest that they're interested in having a conversation to you about, and there's a potential that you'll have an opportunity to get paid to work with them on it. That's kind of it. And that they're actually hoping to have the opportunity to work with you on this shared interest and get paid to do it. And I think if you walk into the interview with that mindset and that mentality, it takes away from a lot of the nerves and a lot of the fear. And I've shared this with a lot of like a few candidates, even just recently in the last kind of few weeks. And they've found that it's actually been really helpful for them, and it's actually done wonders for how they feel walking in. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. As far as that, like, I don't know, relax. um cool. So game time in the actual interview itself. As far as like the actual nature of questions and all that kind of stuff, like I can't really comment too much on that because it'll really depend on the companies and industries and all that kind of stuff. What I can comment on and give some opinions on is, I guess, some common questions and some common things that I've seen people encounter, and I guess some common points of failure on some of these questions and that kind of stuff, and I guess the feedback and based on the feedback I've received from clients, what it is they're really hoping to kind of see. Um, so the first really common one is the storytelling question. And that manifests in the form of, someone being like, hey, like tell us about a time you encountered this, tell us about a time when you had ambiguity on a problem or a requirement. How did you go about solving it? And that kind of stuff. And I think I remember recently Jenna had made a comment. I can't remember exactly what she said, so I don't want to misquote her on it. But I kind of got the sense that people will sometimes struggle on this because they want to give like a perfect answer to this, and they kind of have the impression that the interviewer has a set like perfect answer in mind for what they want to hear already, which is sometimes the case when you're unfortunate enough to have a bad interviewer. What I find in the ideal case with good interviewers is that they're literally just there to hear. They're literally just curious to hear about an experience that you had in the past and want to hear you tell a story, and they want to hear your take on how you resolved it, and what your thought process was at the time, and maybe a bit of like a retro on like, okay, like how like would you do things differently in hindsight. There's really kind of like no hidden agenda to this. Like it's literally a case of like, hey, tell us about a time you encountered this problem, and tell us about how you kind of went about it. Pretty straightforward. No real need to overcomplicate it. The other one is, I guess, more relevant for more technical questions, which is when the interviewers like kind of want to get a sense of where the boundaries lie in your knowledge. And what I mean by that is that some people will get asked on like, hey, like how much do you know on this a particular technology or a framework or methodology or a concept? And there's a little bit of a sense of like they give an answer, and they can kind of tell that the interviewer is waiting for more, which on the candidate side starts becoming an experience of like, I feel like this person is wanting this perfect answer, but I'm not sure what it is, and like this is kind of all I know, which is fine. But I find that what tends to have more success is that once you reach the boundaries of your knowledge, people are really interested to see what do you do at that point, and what is your approach to seeking out knowledge and hypothesizing on potential solutions, or potentially getting new information. Um, and so it's kind of, there's not really a whole lot more to kind of, I guess, expand on that really. For me, when I'm preparing candidates for interviews on this sort of stuff, I tend to just tell them to kind of keep the stuff conversational, and that when it comes to them reaching the boundaries in their knowledge, just kind of talk through your train of thoughts and your line of thinking, and try and keep it conversational and just go from there. And I guess not keep it at just like, hey, this is what I know and that's it. So yeah. Two more common question formats, some common failure points, and some, I guess, advice based on pointers or based on feedback I've had from clients in the past. So as far as like the general interview process, that's kind of really it. To be honest, like there's not a ton of tips and insight that I had to provide. A lot of it, I guess, can be kind of summed up on the points that I've had up until now, where it was if you start from the start and you're purposeful and clear on what you want to be doing, which companies you want to work for, what you want to be doing at those companies, it's sort of like success in the interviews just kind of like tends to just sort of naturally build from there. Um, and I find that as far as the interviews themselves go, as long as you kind of keep in mind that the person who's interviewing you wants you to be successful and wants you to be the person that they hire, and that it should be just more of a conversation than an interrogation. Um, I find the rest just kind of comes naturally. So yeah, another question here. Matthew Lowe, as many on-site interviews are now being done online due to COVID, do you have any tips in particular video call and Zoom interviews? It's an interesting question, actually. So apart from the obvious, which is just make sure that your setup is working properly, make sure that your audio is clear, make sure your connection's clear, and try and minimize latency issues and that kind of stuff. There's really not too many differences. The one thing that I would say is that you want to be a little bit more mindful, and maybe put a little bit more time and thought into what questions that you want to ask, and make more of an effort to ask them, especially when it relates to what the office environment's like, what's the team like, um, especially in recent times, like how's the team actually kind of adjusted themselves. As much as a lot of companies are sort of open to flexible working and that kind of stuff, I find that on-site interviews are helpful because they can give you a bit of a feel of what the office is like, what the team's like, what are the people like, and just general mannerisms and that kind of thing. So in terms of actual interviews and that sort of thing, like I haven't really found that they really differ too much in terms of the format and the types of questions and the type of conversations that you get asked. But I do think that from a candidate's perspective, it's more important now for you to kind of ask questions around what the office culture is like and what it is like working at the business, because now that you're kind of removed from them. So yeah, interesting question. Adam, hey, what should I do in my current job to make myself more employable, deepening or broadening my skill set, working with challenging problems, soft and hard skills? Oh man. What do you think impresses employers most when they look at your work history? Okay, so what impresses employers? If I had to really narrow it down, when it comes to, I'm going to assume this is in the context of like software development jobs. I'm going to say it's having awareness of the commercial and non-technical ramifications and contexts of the work they're doing. All to like it's actually fairly common for me to sort of meet developers who have, I guess, become more blinkered in their work and have lost sight of the greater impact of what it is they're doing, and just kind of get stuck in like, I'm here to sort of ship code, work on this feature, and that's kind of it. Whereas I find that businesses tend to be especially impressed when people can speak about the commercial ramifications of what it is they're working on, especially when it comes to improvements that you might have been like proactive in terms of like working on, due to like, hey, here's a gap in the business that I saw, and this is what I came up with to kind of fix it, or here's something that I saw that could be improved, that kind of thing. So sorry, I know that was kind of like really, really broad. But if I was trying to kind of like narrow it down, is like, yeah, if you really kind of went beyond the scope of like your individual work and broadened your visibility towards like, hey, like, what are the wider ramifications, or what are the wider things I can be having an impact on as an individual. Thomas, how do employers commonly judge technical ability interviews, whiteboarding problems, or take-home tests, or just judging based off the conversation in the interview in your resume? So once you get to the interview process, your resume really becomes much less of a factor. Your resume will be used as a bit of a basis, or to give context on what kind of things you should be asked. Essentially, for the most part, when it comes to interviews, you generally won't be asked about things that you shouldn't know about based on what you've put in your resume. If that makes sense. As far as whiteboarding problems and take-home tests themselves, apart from, I guess, hey, like, does your code work or not work? Like, does your solution actually work? The other thing which I've seen is really, really important is communication skills. And what I mean by that is how well do you talk through your thinking, and how well can you communicate on how it is you got to your solution, and also especially when it comes to take home tests where you have the opportunity to include documentation, like a bit of a README. How much thought do you put into things that you would do if you had more time, or things that you would do if you had more knowledge on X or Y? Um, Almost all of the companies that we work with or have seen do take-home tests will put just as much stock in the quality of the documentation as the actual solution itself. And that communication piece is extends to, I guess, conversation in the interview as well. Like, beyond just like how well do you know your stuff and how well can you give an answer, it also extends to how well can you communicate. Bonus points if you can kind of communicate technical concepts and technical answers to like non-technical people. I find that finding people that have that communication skill is actually much more along with good engineering skills, to say, tends to be incredibly difficult. So if you can do that well, you'll boost your value, I don't know, like twofold. Sam, how common are code tests, whiteboard interviews for junior grad roles? How important is it to ace it? So to be honest, I actually don't find that companies will have different processes for different seniority levels. I find that it tends to be more so that, hey, we have like a general process for everyone, and it's just that the expectations put on you are different depending on if you're a junior or a senior. How important is it to ace it? Fairly. From like an actual like technical perspective, like, I find that it's much more important for you to not bomb it than it is for you to ace it. That makes sense. And I relate them to kind of like those modeling and problem solving math questions you used to get in high school, where it was like, you getting the right answer is just as important, if as you being able to show you're working out. And in some cases, your working out is actually more important and will get you 90% of the mark, or 80% of the way there, if you can kind of show that you're on the right track, or demonstrate knowledge of concepts and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's important. The exception to that, and I guess this kind of leads into my one and only dot point in the general Q&A, is that those Fang companies, which, and I guess Microsoft should be tossed in there, they tend to be a bit of an exception just through the sheer volume of applicants and interest they get. To give my general kind of I guess opinion on those companies, and to be clear, we don't directly work with any of these companies when it comes to recruitment. This is just based on, I guess, secondhand knowledge and from talking to people that have gone through those processes and that kind of stuff. Those kind of companies they have the luxury of putting in a lot more like arbitrary steps in the process and just being far more selective just by virtue of them being who they are and the sheer volume of applicants. And as a result of that, especially in the early stages, yeah, like it tends to be really important that you ace that stuff, just because for them it's just a game of filtering through and really distilling down. For companies that are not in that position, it tends to be as much of a talent attraction problem as it is a talent screening problem. So yeah, for companies, especially in Brisbane, and to an extent even Australia, it's really kind of silly to copy the interview process and the screening process that these companies have, simply because for the same reason why it's silly to copy a technology architecture decision from them. It's just like, frankly, you're not dealing with anywhere near the same kind of problem as these companies are. So for you to be using the same solution is just kind of, yeah, it's pointless. Yeah, that's my kind of take on it. Things like data engineering was not terribly easy to experience working with tools yourself. How do you expose yourself to those sorts of technologies? Yeah, that's a tough one because it's one thing. It's one thing to be building, an app or something like that yourself. It's entirely something different to get access to like massive data sets to kind of apply those skills to. And so I guess the solutions could be twofold. If you're lucky enough to be working in a business where you have, where there's a possibility of you pivoting into that kind of stuff, do that. Like, yeah, the easiest solution is to just like look for opportunities, kind of get exposure to that kind of field in your current company. Failing that, I guess the next best thing is to look at how you can contribute to open source technologies. I don't know about data engineering, but I know for like machine learning, especially, there's a lot of work being done in that space that is open source. So looking for opportunities for you to contribute to that stuff, whether it's contributing upstream to the toolkits themselves, or whether it's collaborating with other people on projects that they're working on, which is, I guess, part of the importance in being involved in meetups and that kind of stuff, because having more contact with people will expose you to more opportunities to do work in open source, and get experience working with this kind of stuff. So it's difficult and it will require a lot of, I guess, extracurricular effort from you, but it is possible. And to be honest, if you do put in the effort and you do get a chance to do it, it will make you much more attractive as a potential hire. Jay, a bit of a different. What are some red flags to look out for in interviews? Signs that a candidate should be wary about the position. Oh man, good question. So to follow up on, I guess, some of those really common questions, like, hey, like, why do you work here, or what are you interested about? If the person that's interviewing you can't give or has trouble giving like an answer to that stuff, that's a pretty obvious red flag. Like, if the person interviewing you has trouble articulating why they enjoy working there, probably not a good sign. Has that happened? Like, does that happen too often? Generally not. But I mean, I don't know. Like, yeah, that tends to be one. I guess the other thing that could be seen as a bit of a red flag is if companies, how do I say this? If companies can't give you a clear idea of what it is you'll actually be doing from day zero, or if a lot of the attraction for you working at that company is predicated on things that haven't happened yet, but are being told to you are going to happen in the future. If that makes sense. Um, whether that's in the form of like, hey, projects that are coming up, things that are going to happen, from an architecture perspective, things are going to happen from a commercial standpoint. Um, if a lot of the reasons why you're attracted to working in that business are predicated on things that haven't happened yet, might want to rethink that stuff. Um, the obvious things in terms of like high staff turnover that can't really be addressed well, or or that the company is, I guess, sort of wary of addressing. Um, we've worked like there are clients that we work with that, to be honest, like have had reasonably high that have had high staff turnover in the past. Um, and but they address that by just being upfront about it and being and I guess sort of acknowledging the fact that they had problems in the past and that was the reason why people left. And in speaking to things that they've done or tried to do to kind of address them. And so transparency in that regard is always, I guess, at least I guess a bit of an orange flag. In the case of like a companies, I guess, happy to acknowledge their shortcomings. That's always good. Whereas if companies try to kind of like gloss over it or are kind of vague about it, that tends to be a bit of a red flag. So hopefully that's helpful. Is an knowledge qualification in favorable? Not really, to be honest. Software development tends to be, I guess, a discipline where academic qualifications just aren't really that relevant or that useful, I should say. What there's very much a commercial premium placed on, a premium placed on commercial experience, and the reason for that is, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, is that the kind of work and the kind of experience you get exposed to in academia is just very, very different from what commercial development is like. From different pressures that you face all the way through to different workflows, different team sizes, different everything. It's just a very, very different environment. And so, if I had to look at it from the perspective of like, hey, honors qualification versus nothing, then yeah, I'd take honors. But if it was honors qualification versus a year of, working on your own projects for other people, working on open source projects, commercial experience especially, yeah, like experience and time spent on the tools doing the things that you're going to eventually end up getting paid to do is going to trump just about everything. So yeah. Cool. Were there any other questions? Anyone else? Hopefully that's been helpful. Not sure. I realize that the stream's on a bit of a delay, so I will pause for a little bit, give people a chance to kind of ask any questions they might ask. Cool. Okay. Well, I guess that about does it, folks. Again, I hate to, I guess, try and distill this down too much or anything like that, but to be honest, interviews are actually really much more straightforward than people try and make them out to be. Whether it's, I guess, through that fear or nerves through that adversarial, like, to that assumption that interviewing is adversarial, or whether it's, fear of failure or anything like that, it's really not that difficult. It really just begins with, and similar to, I guess, how you approach the job search in general, beginning with clarity and beginning with focus and direction in terms of beginning with what it is that you want to be doing and starting and going from there. The rest of it is just kind of really natural. And if you kind of even look at it from the fact that failure is more of a sense, is more from the perspective of like the opening wasn't right and the fit wasn't there, as opposed to a failure in your part. I think it becomes a much more easier pill to swallow. So yeah. Oh, one last thing. How should I reach out to recruiters? Man, just LinkedIn, email. Taking me to my next thing, my slide. This is how. These are all the ways you can reach me. I think I'm actually literally the first result on Google. If you Google my name, I'm not sure if that's just me, but anyway, we're super easy people to reach out to. My phone number and email are plastered all over the internet. So just hit me up. Any other questions? I'm in the UQCS Slack as well, so I can be reached from there. If people have any other questions, anything like that. Dedicated resume roast session. Yeah, happy to do one in the future. I do think that I was maybe a little bit too positive on Max's one in the past, so keen to revisit that and absolutely destroy it. And I am also quite present. I'm always happy to give feedback on resumes or anything like that. So if people want to email me, hit me up on Twitter, LinkedIn, Slack, whatever, with your resumes and get advice, always have time to do that stuff. So yeah, feel free.
Okay. Cool. Thanks to Harold for giving this talk, and thanks everyone for tuning in. It's really cool that you have a GitHub, by the way. That I didn't know that. I'll definitely see what you have there. But yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in.